Good morning, everybody. Hello! Welcome! If you are new here, welcome to my channel. My name is Dustin, and this channel, Modern Metaphysical, is about all things esoteric and occult related, with a very heavy lean on the tarot. If you are returning, thank you so very much for coming back and hanging out. Today we are doing an episode of Coffee and Cartomancy, so I hope everybody has a lovely cup of coffee or an adult beverage if you're somewhere else in the world, and we are going to hang out and have a lovely little chat about pushing our own tarot boundaries. So this is just something I've been thinking about a lot lately, so I thought it would be a really good topic for today's Coffee and Cartomancy. As always, with all of my videos, if you have a question or a comment you would like me to see or read, be sure to do @ and then Modern Metaphysical in chat so it highlights it nice and bright for me, or put it in all capital letters so I don't miss it. And if I do miss it, because chat can get a little busy sometimes, just feel free to keep posting it until I see it. I promise you won't get in trouble. As always, too, you will find all sorts of good information down in the description box below. Some of the things I've picked to share today, I haven't put it down there yet, but if you are interested in some of the things that I share in this video, whether you're watching live now or you're watching the replay in the future, all of that should be in the description box after the replay gets posted later today. So if you're looking for any information about things that I share today, come back and check that out. Or if you're watching in the future times, it should already be down there. So yeah, I hope everybody's doing good. It's crazy how fast January is flying by. So, yeah, it's a fun topic. It's something that I've been like mulling over in my head for a while now. Mostly instigated by people that I know. So, yeah. Lisa is making vegetarian chili with some wine. Ooh, that is delicious sounding. All right, so let's dive into the chat today, and by all means, if you're watching this live, please feel free to contribute in chat. I will try and do a better job than usual of paying attention and keeping caught up with chat. So please feel free to contribute. If you're watching this in the future, please feel free to leave a comment down in the comment section below, so we can keep talking about this kind of topic. I think sometimes in the tarot community, especially here on YouTube and on Facebook, it can be really easy for us to fall into the trap, into a couple of traps. One is bandwagoning, right? A couple or a few tarot personalities, whether it's me or other YouTubers, may post reviews of a deck and everyone just jumps on it and it becomes wildly popular. Whether it really kind of deserves it or not. There are a lot of decks that have become wildly popular that, when you look at them critically, really aren't that good. And that's, there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's part of being a human being. We are naturally social and pack animals, and we do place value in other people's opinions, and that's great, right? Like, most of you are here probably because you value my opinion in some regard, which is still so weird for me to think about. But there's a tendency sometimes to do that. There's also a tendency to really only watch content or consume things that fall within our own sort of sphere of acceptability or comfort. And what I mean by that is that a lot of times we find ourselves being drawn towards similar, like-minded people, and that's great, right? That's one of the best ways to build friendships and things like that. But at the same time, one thing that I found, especially in art school, was that people who had completely different perspectives and viewpoints on art or creating art or working on art were the ones that influenced me the most. And I still think that's true for me as a tarot practitioner, as a content creator, and as, a human being, right? If you look at the people I've surrounded myself with, right? Specifically Lisa and Danny. If you're not familiar with Three Fat Readers, I co-host a monthly kind of podcast style thing. I can't use my words because I'm so not caffeinated. With Lisa Pepez, who's in chat right now, and Danny Mystic. And we sit down and talk about different tarot topics every month. But the one thing that is so great about those discussions and those videos and live chats is that the three of us have very, very, very different tastes and ways of reading the tarot. And we constantly challenge each other about those things and our assumptions. We constantly push each other to try new things and expose each other to new things. And through those interactions, I have found some really interesting decks that I never would have given extra thought to had it not been for those two, right? And it's not to say that those are the only two people that have done that, right? There's been a number of people on YouTube who I watch who have completely different taste in tarot for me, right? Kelly Fitzgerald over at Truth and Story is a perfect example. Her taste in tarot is dramatically different than mine. In fact, her entire style of reading the tarot, the way she makes videos, everything is completely different. But I enjoy watching her content because it's a lot of times I come across things that I may not always have really looked at or really paid attention to. So it's a matter for me of holding up, it's a way for me to hold up a mirror to myself, but it's also a way to look at the diamond and the multiple facets that it has, right? And I think sometimes we as tarot practitioners can fall into the trap of only working with tarot that we're comfortable with, right? And it's not to say that there's anything wrong with that, but in terms of tarot, there seems to be this trend of people who only want to work with decks that make them feel good, who only who don't read guidebooks or books about tarot, who, there seems to just be a lot of laziness is what I'll call it in tarot, right? And it's not to say that intuitive readings don't have validity. They absolutely do. I believe in using my intuition, right? But at the same time, having a foundational knowledge and skill set, right, is an important part of being a tarot reader. So one thing that I found myself over the last year or so doing is kind of pushing myself in terms of what I buy and what I bring into my collection. And there are a number of things that have come into my collection, intentionally or not, that normally would not be something that I look at, right? And the first one that kind of happened is actually totally Lisa's fault. Calling you out, Lisa. I don't know if you're making coffee or walking your dog, but I'm calling you out. So the first time this really struck me, because I've always been a collector and a reader, right? And those two things are two very different things. If anyone tells you differently, they're just wrong. But I've always been a collector and a reader, and both in the decks that I choose to work with and the decks that I collect, I do have a very distinct aesthetic. I love sort of vintage vibes. I love very deep and esoteric decks and very artistically driven decks. And that's the kind of stuff that I am drawn to. I mean, if you watch my channel, I'm sure you can tell what decks I love out the gate. And then this showed up at my desk. And I was like, I never, ever, 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 ever would have purchased this deck for myself. Ever. Ever. Lisa sent me this. This is the Cat Tarot, by the way. And she sent me this. And I was like, okay, let's give it a chance, right? Everything happens for a reason. This obviously came into my life to teach me something, and I'm going to work with it and use it and see kind of what happens. And in terms of this deck's art, let's switch to the other camera so that you guys can see this a little bit better. this this deck has kind of a very like watercolory kind of art style. I actually really like the art. But it's not, it's not really esoteric, right? Like it's a bunch of pictures of cats in the context of like tarot. And it's not something that like I would have ever really bought for myself or really considered, because when I read the tarot for myself, it's usually for very profound reasons. It's not kind of like, on a whim thing. And I'm definitely not a person, I've talked about this before, where there's value in doing daily card pulls, but at the same time, I only do those when I'm trying to learn a deck, or learn something, right? It's a really good learning tool, but in terms of like value of what I'm getting out of those readings, you don't get a lot, right? Like it's it's kind of like the weather forecast, watching the weather, right? Well, I can look out the window too. So, I tend not to do those. But for this deck, I started doing just daily card pulls with it. And I found sort of this like very comforting vibe, which is not something I've experienced a whole lot in tarot, right? And I started to see why people are drawn and attracted to these kinds of decks and these kinds of reading styles, right? Because it is nice when, you're kind of peering into the threads of fate, per se, and you get a nice warm hug. And it's not to say that there isn't the negative cards in here, right? There's still a Tower card. There's still all of the, Three of Swords and all of those cards that, look at this face, he's so cute. All of those cards that we normally associate with negative connotations, but they just don't quite hit as hard, right? But for me, this totally pushed my boundaries of tarot and what I was willing to work with. And then I started really thinking, like, well, why was I so adverse to working with this deck, right? Like, why when I saw this, right, was it just a matter of judging a book by its cover? What did I think that what was the factor that devalued it for me, right? And I realized for me that like tarot has always been a very deep, meaningful spiritual thing, and this kind of felt like it was devaluing that for me. And it took a while for me to understand that, sometimes a walk in the park is okay, right? You don't necessarily need to go to a church or a temple to have a spiritual, profound experience, right? Just a walk in a city park can lead to a really magical moment, right? And that was the kind of analogy that I found within myself that struck me and was like, oh, there's a reason why this came into my collection, right? Now, is it something that I would still buy for myself? Probably not. But at the same time, it has started making me look at things in a different light. And when I go to look at new decks or shop for new decks, right, and I have those knee-jerk reactions of like, oh, absolutely not for me, right? Now, I question them, right? I stop for a moment and I go, wait, why am I having this knee-jerk reaction, right? Why am I suddenly adverse to this? What is it about this, right? And sometimes the conclusion from those questionings, right, is, oh, it's just really poorly made and the art is just not fully realized, and that's okay. But other times it starts a sort of internal dialogue. And one of the decks that recently came into my collection where that also occurred was this, the Somnia Tarot. And I talked about this briefly a couple of lives ago. Oh, I've got like the hiccups. Let me get a drink. Oh, coffee. Okay. I talked about this briefly a couple of lives ago, and when I first saw the Somnia Tarot, right, I had another knee-jerk reaction. I looked at it and I was like, what? Like, what is why is everybody wrapped in a sheet? Like, what is the deal here? Like, what is this about? And as someone who studied photography extensively, when I went to art school, my emphasis was photography and painting. Those were the two things I double emphasized because I'm an overachiever like that. But when I went to art school, photography was like my jam. I loved photography. And so for me, photography decks have always been really hard to connect with for a couple of reasons. One, the empathic side of me tends to connect with the people in the photographs and not the artwork being presented. The other is I can't help but dissect the photograph from an artistic standpoint, right? And so that kind of detracts the sort of want to work with it. So when I saw this deck originally, I was like, wow, those are some intense images. Those are some mind-blowing sort of depictions of the cards. And I don't know if that's for me, right? That was kind of my first reaction. And this came out, it was towards the end of 2020, if I remember. Or no, it was 2021, yeah. This came out at a period in my life that was very difficult and challenging, right? And I was like, yeah, nope. And it got to the point, like, it had funded on Kickstarter. It had completely gone through all of its sort of project life cycle and was now for sale by the creator on their website. And I started to see it pop up on other YouTube creator channels talking about this deck, right? And I was like, I'll watch some reviews, see all of the cards and that kind of stuff. And then it started to really strike me, right? The imagery is really beautiful and really powerful. And I started asking myself that question of like, why did I have such a knee-jerk reaction to this? And why was I so serious and kind of pushing it away? And I started really thinking about it. One thing, the deck was created during the pandemic, and so the whole like covering of the face thing is kind of a reflection of that, right? The other aspect is that it is a very dark and very intense deck, and because it aligned with a very dark and intense like part of my life, it almost scared me, I guess is the best way to say it. It was kind of like, I'm not ready to deal with that yet. And then it kind of struck me, well, maybe this is the thing that I need to deal with that. And so I bought it on a whim. When I purchased this, I was still 100% not confident. I was like, I'm probably going to hate this, and I'm probably going to regret it, and I'm probably going to have to rehome it. And then it arrived, and I started working with it. And I started specifically doing readings around a lot of the challenges and difficulties and things like that I had in the year, and it became really, really profound and moving, right? And it was really difficult. It was really hard. It was some of the hardest sort of tarot work and reflection that I've ever done. But I realized part of my knee-jerk reaction to this deck and why I was so adverse to purchasing this deck was because I knew it was going to have that effect, right? And I didn't want to go through that. I wasn't ready at that time. And not being ready at the time is okay, right? But I think sometimes it's easy for people to say, you know what, not now, and then it never happens, right? So for me, again, this was another moment of pushing my boundaries, right? This deck 100% made me uncomfortable. Like, perfectly honest here, 100% made me uncomfortable the first couple of times I read with it. I was like, I don't know. And it stirred up a whole lot of emotions and memories in me that were really challenging to deal with. But after I did readings, I did some journaling about things. I sat with things. I thought about things. I went for walks. I stayed up late at night when I should have not. All of those kinds of things, right? It became a deck that has profoundly influenced me in my personal practice, as well as a deck that now has a very special place within my collection, right? And all of that because I pushed my boundaries, right? So I'm sure you're kind of seeing a trend here in this discussion, right? About how when it comes to tarot, right, it can be easy to only work with things that we're used to and comfortable with. and that sometimes those knee-jerk reaction moments, the decks that we have those strong feelings about, are ones that can turn out to be really profoundly influential on us, right? Um, let me catch up with chat here just briefly. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Aspasia had a reverend say that going to McDonald's can be a sacred experience. You don't have to be in church. And I remember that. Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because like there's like these camps in the tarot community, right? You have like the hyper occult and esoteric camp of like tarot is absolutely predictive and spiritual. You have like the hyper psychological camp where it's like tarot is just a tool for us to look at our own psychology, and they're like very Jungian about it, right? And then you also have like what I like to call the woo camp, which is like completely light washed, and it's just like we're children of the stars, then you know we're here to experience each other's energy, and and I definitely lean into the first camp, right? But going and visiting those other camps, right, and experiencing them has always led to me learning and growing, right, about my own practice, about my own spirituality, about the things that make me uncomfortable, right, or the things that I'm drawn to, okay? So another deck, as an example here of pushing my tarot boundaries that just came into my collection is this, the Crimson Eye Tarot. Now, I saw this on Kickstarter, and I was like, oh, that's weird. And I like weird, right? We all know I like weird, but this was maybe a little too weird for me. And I was like, why is this, like, I don't know, like, what is it about this? The box on this, by the way, you guys, is, like, terribly hard and difficult to open. You have to, like, do the, like, thing. But for me, like, the aesthetic in this deck does fall into an aesthetic that I normally enjoy, but this leaned into like kind of a like the one eye thing was just a little too weird for me, right? The some of the depictions were just kind of a little off, right? And I was like, what is it about this that is making me have that feeling of like, I don't know, like I don't know if I'll ever use that. What is it, right? And I realized for me this was more about an exploration of my expectations of tarot, right? When I see tarot decks, right, when tarot comes up, I have such a long history with tarot, right? I started reading the tarot at a very young age, right? I was a teenager. I studied tarot in art school. I've had a very long history with tarot. And so when I see tarot decks, I have expectations, right? I have certain things that I look for. I have certain things that I want. And for me, I wanted to love this. Like, I was like, I like the artwork, but like, oh, this is so, like, it's so strange. Like, is this just being weird to be weird, right? It was that kind of a conversation in my head, is like, are we just doing this to be weird? And then I realized, like, I don't think that's what it's about, right? It's very consistent. And I think sometimes, like, for me, this deck turned into looking at things and getting what you don't expect, right? When I started doing readings with this, it started giving me readings that were completely things that I was not expecting, right? It was making me look at things in a different way, right? And it was pushing my expectational boundaries, right? Of what I wanted out of a tarot and how I read with tarot and things like that. This was a deck that I found myself going and researching in terms of like, okay, so here we have the Wheel of Fortune, right? And there's a bunch of snakes on it, right? And like looking into like the history and symbolism of snakes and the history and symbolism of the eye or of eyes and all of those kinds of things, because it's not your usual sort of depiction, right? So it pushed my boundaries, right? It was a deck that made me really look at the tarot through a different lens, right? Is this a deck that I'm going to probably continue to use day in and day out? No, absolutely not. But it taught me something, right? And I think that's the big part of why I collect tarot decks and why sometimes I do purchase the decks that I have really strong reactions to, of like, I don't know if that's for me, right? Because a lot of times those are the decks that are going to teach me something. And this one taught me to not have such strong expectations when it comes to working with the tarot and the images that I see presented on tarot cards. So for me, that was a big, profound moment, right? And it's like, when you look at the deck objectively, it is a pretty traditional deck. But it's just kind of weird. It's just kind of weird. Devin says I only buy decks that are pretty and are in the same aesthetic. Yeah, and that's generally, I talked about that a little bit earlier. Like, I do sometimes, like, I think we all get trapped in that staying within our own bubble sort of space when it comes to tarot, right? And that's kind of what started this conversation of like, well, what happens when you push your boundary, when you push your bubble, right? What can result from that? So, and this deck has really affected me in what my expectations are when I sit down for a reading, and when I look at cards and how I read cards, right? In terms of like what I'm looking for symbolically, right? Because this, although it is very RWS, right? There's so much that's kind of like off about it. It really makes you look at the cards, which I think is a very big thing. It does look like a Danny deck. I agree. I think Danny would really enjoy this one. But I think, it's one of those instances that, I looked at it, I had this very strong knee-jerk reaction because it didn't meet my normal expectations and standards. And then when I got it in my hands, it really made me look at tarot in a different way, right? And, again, this probably isn't a deck that I'm going to work with every day or, very often, but it's something that, when I need that, like, palette cleanse, when I need to get outside of my head or look at things from a different perspective or get out of the box, this might be something that I reach for very often, right? Another good example of pushing my own tarot boundaries is this deck. For a long time I wouldn't say issue is not the proper word, but I avoided decks that were overtly feminine. Not to say that there's anything wrong with that. It's just, as a man, right? Like, I like to see myself reflected in the tarot. So when I see decks that are like pink and all of the cards have women on them, I tended to just lean away from it. And when I had a viewer, I don't know if you're watching today, but if you are, thank you. I had a viewer send me the link to this deck and was like, "Hey, I think you would like this." And I looked at it and I was like, no, no, I wouldn't. And then I had this moment of like, well, wait, why does this person think I would like it? Like, what? Like, what am I missing? I have to be missing something, right? Like, what? Why would this person send this to me if they and say that I think I would like it and enjoy it, when it's definitely not something I've really shown on my channel before, right? It does kind of lean into that Moonchild, Starchild vibe, but at the same time, it's very feminine, right? So I had that moment again where I was like, okay, you know what? Like, this popped up in my life for a reason. Let's get it and just see what happens, right? Why not? Why not, right? And I was kind of surprised, right? So it's a beautiful deck, by the way. It's very well packaged and very well made. And it has a great little guidebook. Now, as you can see, it is pink. And I don't know if you guys can see my space and like what I wear normally. But pink is not usually within my color sphere as a human being. So I was like, ooh, that's a lot of pink. And I was like, all right, well, let's just check this out. Let's see what this is about. And I started flipping through the cards, and I was like, oh, this is a little woo. It's a little woo, and it is very feminine, right? Very feminine. In fact, the Emperor card doesn't even have a dude in it. It's a rock. It's like a fallen statue, okay? The Lovers has a guy in it, though. And there are men depicted in the deck. But overall, it's a very feminine deck. And I started working with it, and I was kind of like, well, why did this person think that I would enjoy this? And then I was like, well, there is a lot of kind of esoteric symbolism, right? Especially like here on the Wheel of Fortune. The artwork is beautiful, right? I mean, look at this. This is gorgeous. But it's not quite something that I wanted to work with. And then I kind of started working with it in kind of a sacred feminine way, and like exploring my own femininity and my own sort of divine feminine side of things. And it became really profound, right? It's like one of those instances where, like, I think if I was born a woman and I was still making like videos on YouTube, right? Like, I think in an alternate like universe or reality, right, I would have tons of decks like this, and I would just be like gushing over them, right? And when I started kind of working with it in that regard, right, I was like, oh, like I understand this now, right? Like there's value in this when it comes to working on like accepting my own sort of like feminine trends and like liking and enjoying things that are feminine, right? Gender is such a weird thing to talk about in today's society. And we all have sort of these gender biases and norms, and even spiritually, right, that exists. And so for me, this was about exploring that other side of me that, you know, I just really never thought about before. And I've been really enjoying working with this deck in that kind of a context, right? So for me, like, this is not an everyday deck. This is not a deck I'm going to pick up and work with on a daily basis. But when it comes to exploring those sides of me, or exploring those kinds of relationships, like relationships that I have with women, whether it's my mother or friends or you know, family members, etc., you know, this has become a really interesting and beautiful deck to work with. Can we talk about these quartz? Because they're just freaking amazing. This deck, for whomever just asked in chat, is the Ethereal Alchemist Tarot. I don't have links down in the description yet if you're watching this live, but when the replay gets posted on my channel, I will have links to all of these decks down in the description box. So if you're interested in any of the stuff I'm sharing today, come back and check later when the video gets posted, and all of the goodies should be in the description. And I usually will copy that and put it in a comment and pin it as well. So yeah, it's just been a really interesting deck to work with in that regard, right? And so again, you know, this is a perfect example of pushing my own tarot boundaries, right? Of, you know, looking at something that came into my sphere, right? Through influence, my sphere of influence, right? Because a viewer suggested it to me, and just kind of trusting that and taking the dive and seeing where it took me. You know, sometimes it's just about floating on top of the river to make it through the rapids, right? And for me, this was, you know, one of those experiences where I was like, you know, I don't want to, no, like, that's not me, right? This card, like, was really profound, right? And for me, it was like, I was so adverse to working with these kinds of decks for a long time. And then when I took them out of the context of my expectations and out of the usual way that I read tarot, and looked at it from a different place it became something that was really valuable and taught me a lot, right? Not only as a person, but as a tarot reader, right? And that's, that's what this whole discussion is about. The last deck that I kind of wanted to touch on, again, this is another Lisa made me do it deck. And that's this deck. This is the Dream Vision Tarot, and I saw this on Kickstarter for a while, and I was like, I don't know about that. And it's kind of one of those, look at the gilding on it, it's so pretty. But again, this is another one of those decks that's just like, it leans into that sort of woo side of tarot, of like this very ethereal spirit realm, I guess. And when I saw it, I was kind of like, yeah, the art's really modern. The themes are kind of interesting. The figures are a little creepy. They're kind of alien, right? There's kind of a little bit of like a, I feel like I'm getting abducted vibe from this. But at the same time, right, it's really beautiful. But I had kind of just passed it off, right? This was one of the instances where I was like, yeah, that's a maybe. That's a hard maybe. But then other things came up and they surpassed it on the wish list or the fun money budget list, right? And it just didn't happen. And then I think wasn't it the last 3 Fat Readers? I think it was the last 3 Fat Readers. Lisa brought this deck out, and I was like, okay, like, what I miss? And listening to her talk about it really, like, intrigued me, right? And it's one of those moments where I was still like, I don't know if that's for me. Excuse me. And this hermit, though, can we talk about how beautiful this hermit is? I was like, I don't know if that's for me. Like, this is still not a deck that is really my aesthetic. I don't know. And I was like, you know what? Like, it keeps popping up. Let's just try it. Let's see what happens, right? Push the boundaries. And so I got it, and I started working with it, and I found that it really, this was actually a deck that like made me delve into my own self, like, subconscious, right? And kind of like has become a really interesting deck for me to work with in a shadow aspect, which has been really interesting. Not something that I would have expected from this artwork, but for whatever reason, it became a very highly reflective. And I think that's because the way the figures in this deck are presented are very, like, ambiguous and in a sort of like everyman kind of way. And because of that, right, it's allowed me to kind of place myself within the deck, I think. And it does feel otherworldly. It feels very liminal, right? And it's become a deck that I have turned to when I have readings that I want to explore something about myself that I don't understand, right? Or that I'm struggling with. Like, why did I react this way to this situation? Or, why do I have anxiety surrounding this when logically I know, that it's nothing to be afraid of, right? Those kinds of questions have become really fueled by this deck and looking at myself in a different way, in a different lens. And it's not something I would have picked up normally for that kind of thing, right? And I think is another perfect example of kind of pushing my own tarot boundaries. So, yeah. It's really cool. It's a really cool deck. It's really beautiful. So, that is kind of what I wanted to share and discuss with you guys today. Really was the decks that are in my collection that normally wouldn't be in my collection, and they came to me from one sphere of influence or another, whether it was my friends within the tarot community or other tarot YouTube content creators, or just through complete and sheer chance, right? Sometimes when you have those knee-jerk reactions to a deck where you're like, no. Like, you look at it and you're like, absolutely fucking not. You're like, like, what is that, right? sometimes those knee-jerk reactions are a clue, a hint that there's something deeply profound there that you maybe should explore. Other times it's completely that, right? There have been decks that I've looked at and I'm like, and that's because like the artwork is terrible and like they're not even depicting the tarot in a remotely like normal way, or you know, it's just like you can tell it's cheaply made, right? And those are valid experiences as well. But sometimes like when you look at a deck that's highly popular in one sphere compared to the sphere that you normally hang out in, sometimes it's worth kind of looking at that and being like, well, why do all these people enjoy it, but why don't I enjoy it, right? Is there a shadow aspect there to explore? Is there something about this deck that maybe I'm just missing because of my own like preconceived notions and expectations of what a tarot deck should be, right? And you know, it's not to say go out and buy every deck that you have that reaction to, but every once in a while, right, it's good to pull the trigger on some of those decks and see where they take you, and see what they have to offer and teach you, even if it's just something that you work with for a month and then you move on from your collection, right? I think that's a really good, healthy thing to do, and I think it allows us to look at the spectrum of tarot, because it really is a spectrum, right? Like there's no black or white, right? Marseille is not the best tarot, neither is RWS, neither is Thoth, right? Like, and there are people out there who will make those claims, right? Like, well, you're not a tarot reader if you don't read using the Thoth. Oh, you're not a tarot reader if you don't read using the Marseille, right? Like, that's not that's not a reality. And so sometimes I think it's important for us to go outside of our comfort zone, go outside of our own boundaries, and try working with some of these decks that we have negative reactions to. And in those cases where I have done that, they've become some of the most profound decks that I've worked with in one capacity, right? Again, they're not like these huge decks that I'm going to work with on a constant daily basis to do readings, right? Like, you know, I pull this out a lot for client readings. This is the Tarot de Marseille Wait, right? Because it's one of those decks that meets a lot of other people's expectations, right? And so it's good to use for reading with others. But for me, right, using some of these odder decks that I would not be typically attracted to, has led to some really fun and powerful moments. And again, they're not decks I'm going to pull out every day from now on, right? The Cat Tarot is not something I pull out every day, but I keep it because sometimes I do need that tarot reading that's just like a warm hug, right? Same with the Somnia Tarot, right? The Somnia Tarot is not a deck that I pull out and work with every day, but sometimes when I'm having deep-seated anxiety about that dark part of my life and I need to work through some of those emotions and memories, I pull that deck out and work with it, right? So I encourage all of you to stretch your tarot boundaries. Let me know in live chat now or in the comments if you're watching in the future if you have had a deck that has pushed your own tarot boundaries where it's not something you would have ever normally purchased and then all of a sudden you purchased it because why not, and how that's profoundly impacted you and shaped you. So yeah. Are there any questions in chat? Does anybody have any questions? Hands down, my favorite deck of 2021. This one? Is this your favorite deck of 2021? It's really beautiful. This deck right here, for someone, I think someone asked, this is the Dream Vision Tarot. The 78 Tarot Astral deck has a lot of really confronting imagery for me. Definitely don't use it super often, but it's great working, but it's great for working with my shadow. Yeah. Why do people feel once they've heavily worked with a deck and are ready to move on that they need to get rid of a deck? If you've loved it once, you might want to return it. I think that's different for everyone, Arlene. I think like there are collectors, right? And there are readers. And I think sometimes things need to come and go in our life, right? And that's okay. There are decks that I've brought in, had kind of had it teach me something, but then realized like it's still not for me, right? Like, and I'm never gonna touch it again, and I've moved those out of my collection. And that's okay too. And there's also decks that I have in my collection that I probably will very, very rarely work with, right? The Sabbath Tarot is a perfect example of that. It's another deck that really pushed, although it falls within my aesthetic, it made me feel really uncomfortable in terms of exploring like sexuality and things like that. And so for me, that deck is not something that I work with very often, but I keep it because when I want to work in that sphere of influence, right, I pull that out. Lightseer's third iteration, because one of the cards reminds me of my ex-husband. Yeah, that can be challenging. I can see that. This is a really important place to be open. Thanks for raising it. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, like, I've seen this like trend, especially lately in tarot, where like everybody is just sort of either bandwagoning onto the same things, or they they just kind of, I don't know how to say this any nicer, but like they'll talk about a deck, whether it's on Facebook or on YouTube or wherever, right? They just shit on a deck because it falls outside of their own expectations for tarot, instead of taking a moment to step back and say, you know what, this deck is valid. It may not be for me, and why is it not for me, right? And it can be easy just to do that, right, without thinking, but really, like, there's validity in all of these things that are created. Whether we define them as good or not, all that's all subjective, right? But sometimes when you have those knee-jerk reactions, it's good to check them, right? Like, am I having this knee-jerk reaction because of a valid reason? Is it just a really poorly created, poorly designed, poorly executed deck? Or is it because there is something there to explore? I was watching Danny's channel the other day and was oddly attracted to the super masculine decks she was showing. Reminded me of your use of the feminine deck here. Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. The Hayworth Tarot was a boundary pusher. Not a fan of horror or gore, but it's one of my... Yeah, the Hayworth Tarot is a little odd. But I love the Hayworth Tarot because I've listened to the podcast for so long. So for me, it was like a fandom tarot deck, and less about like the strangeness of the deck itself. So yeah, for sure. Are there any other questions? I can't believe we're already in an hour. I feel like we just started. I literally feel like we just started this video. And again, if you think about a question, or you think about a deck that really kind of shaped you in the same way, a deck that really profoundly changed your perspective, where you had a really negative initial reaction and then it turned into something that, you know, really transformed your perspective on it, you know, please come back and share that in the comments. Or if you're watching this later, right now, right, in the future time, you know, drop a comment down below. Hughes Grove says, I'm very late to the game, but I so agree with people crapping all over about decks. What do you think about the Tarot of Crowley? Arlene, are you talking about the Thoth Tarot? I mean, Aleister Crowley and Lady Frida Harris's work is just as influential and profound as Arthur Edward Waite's and Pamela Coleman Smith's in terms of the revival and renaissance of the tarot at the turn of the century. I really love working with Thoth decks. They're intense, I guess is the best way I can describe them, but I do really enjoy it. Do you have a favorite masculine deck? Yeah, I do. Tarot of the Divine Masculine is probably my favorite. That's a really, just a really beautiful deck. Do I have Tarot of the Cat People? Vintage vibes, interesting. I don't have the... I've looked at it a number of times, and it's one of those decks that's like floated on and off of my my wish list, but I've never pulled the trigger on it. Oh, you think that they mean Christopher James just called Tarot? I don't think I've looked at that enough to really have an informed opinion about that deck, to be perfectly honest. But Christopher James, let me look that up really quickly. Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to look this one up. Yeah, I'll have to check it out. I haven't looked at it very much. Do you have a spreadsheets of all the deck you owe? I understand it'll be hard. Devin, I actually catalog all of my collection in an app called Libib. It actually has a forward-facing platform in which you can actually peruse my entire library. I've been holding off on sharing the link to that widely until I do my my collection video. So it's in the works, and I do want to share that, and it basically would allow you to just kind of peruse my tarot shelf. So yeah. Stray Cat says it makes me laugh because it's very RWS. Crowley must be rolling in his grave. I think. Well, I mean, like Crowley, and A.E. Waite, like they drew influence from the same spheres, right? So I think, you know, I think Crowley would like be that adverse to kind of that kind of thing. So, but yeah, I'll definitely check that one out. It's on my list. I have a note about it somewhere to like look more into it, but this week it's just been so crazy. Like yesterday I was supposed to go and have my booster shot, and then like the day flew out of handle and there was the scheduling snafu, and now I have to go get it later today. And like, it's just been one of those weeks where like Mercury retrograde is like in full swing. Like, let's just screw everything up. So yeah, cool. Well, I don't see a whole lot of other questions in the chat. So like I said, if you are watching this live now and you're interested in some of the things I shared today, I will come back and add the links to that in the description box below as soon as I turn the live stream off, so you can come back and check that out in like 20 minutes. It should be up and ready to go. If you're watching this in the future, all of the good stuff should be down in the description box below already, as well as in the comment section, so check that out. Leave a comment, let me know what some decks are that has really kind of pushed your own tarot boundaries and things like that. And yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for hanging out and talking about this topic. I think it's an important one sometimes for us to sort of get out of our own comfort zone a little bit. So I think it's critical for us to have those moments of looking at things from other perspectives. So I really appreciate each and every one of you and all of your continued love and support. And as always, remember that everyone is fighting a battle that you know nothing about. So be kind, always. We'll see you guys around YouTube. Bye, everybody.